Hello everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and we're going to talk about Rocky IV. And due to the director's cut of the movie soon to be released on November the 12th 2021, I thought it would be appropriate to reflect on the original version and just review it overall in terms of its impact culturally when it was released and the legacy that it has left since it's released. Now there will be obvious spoilers for this film just in case you haven't seen it, which seems ridiculous now. The Rocky franchise itself is so iconic, it seems that everybody within fandom and entertainment and general audience has seen Rocky IV, but just in case you haven't, just a spoiler warning now. Now of course, as we all know, with Rocky IV, it was released way back in November the 27th 1985, and it stars of course Sylvester Stallone reprising his role as Rocky Balboa, Talia Shire as Adrian, Carl Weathers returning as Apollo Creed, Burt Young as Paulie, and of course it introduced us to Dolph Lundgren as Ivan Drago and also Bridget Nielsen as his wife. Now the story around Rocky IV centres Rocky at the very top of the boxing world, having regained his title from Rocky III. Apollo feels the need to return to boxing and take on the emerging, almost indestructible force of the new Soviet fighter Ivan Drago, and sadly this fight with Drago ends in tragedy when Apollo is beaten to death inside the ring. Now Rocky, filled with lots of guilt and remorse as he trained Apollo for this fight, steps up to challenge Ivan Drago in what ultimately will be the most dangerous fight of his life. Now for me, nearly 40 years plus after its release, Rocky IV still remains an iconic and transcendent film from the 1980s. It definitely was integral for me as a youngster growing up in the 80s. It was the most epic installment of the Rocky Balboa films, and Rocky Balboa himself, for me and really a whole generation of viewers, was one of the most inspirational heroes within all of cinema. Now from a more critique point of view, in terms of the movie itself, many will point to the overuse of soundtrack songs, training montages, comic strip violence, and the obvious Cold War overtones between US and Russian relations. Many people have criticised the movie for being almost more of a music video as opposed to an actual cinematic story. But to me, all of these elements are what makes Rocky IV so special. And actually, when you look at the movie itself, there is more depth to the overall story than many give it credit for. We actually have quite substantial themes such as friendship and brotherhood, with Rocky supporting Apollo. Their relationship of course developed so much through Rocky III, and then even defined so in the great scene between them at the beginning of the movie, when that discussion between the two as they're watching their previous fight from Rocky II, where Rocky essentially tries to talk Apollo out of fighting Drago, and Apollo emphasises very much so the fighting nature that they are both immersed in. We are very much the warriors, that's who we are. There's a great discussion about whether you should change or stay true to your overall nature, and I think it's a great scene overall, brilliantly acted by Carl Weathers, and this again makes the film so relatable overall. How many of us have been in the same scenario where we see our best friend looking to do something that we feel they shouldn't do, but we still back them all the way to do it? We later on cover that sense of regret and remorse seen through Rocky, of course, when he stands in the ring watching Apollo getting battered to death. And again, it ties to the other relatable theme of what would you do if you saw your best friend getting beaten to death and you felt responsible? Would you look to move past it? Would you spend your time wallowing away in regret? Or would you look to gain some sort of reference or revenge? It makes us emphasize even more so with Rocky that what we already did, and I think that overall sense of revenge is just about enough of a sound motivation to make us understand why he wants to get into the ring against Drago, despite Adrian's protestations that we get in another fantastic scene when she talks about him and the fact that going up against Drago is suicide. Rocky again refers to the conversation that he had previously with Apollo about how he's a warrior, that's the way he's made, we can't change who we are. Again, that fabric, that theme of looking at ourselves and can we change who we are? Also, very strong themes here that we see throughout this film. We look at the idea of a sportsman or an athlete having to attain their absolute peak condition, and any sports fan who has followed a specific team or specific athlete can relate to this as well, because they see that athlete or that sportsman in the beginning of their career when they're much more of a raw talent, and then over the course of their career you see them evolve into their ultimate performance. And that's what makes again Rocky IV so relatable. Supported by Stallone's unrelenting commitment to his own physical condition, Rocky IV is really the ultimate evolution of the character when we see and reflect on his arc from the first movie, and Rocky IV is really the peak of that evolution arc where we see him transform into the super lean, ripped physical condition. And really that makes sense overall in terms of the realm of boxing when you see multiple fighters as they start their careers and when they reach the peak level of it, often you see their physique transform, and that's what we see in terms of Rocky here. Now, some have mocked the movie for presenting Rocky far more of the muscle man type, taking away a lot of the vulnerability that they felt was presented in certainly the first two films. But if you look at the overall arc of the franchise, this transformation makes complete sense. There's no way that Rocky could even contend with Drago in his form from Rocky 1 or Rocky 2. I would even say Rocky 3 as well, where he was presented as far more of a leaner, more skillful fighter, as those were the attributes he had to attain in order to beat Clubber Lang. Adds weight to the story that the hero or the protagonist has to be at their fullest and absolute peak in order to take on the movie's villain. And when we talk about the movie's villain, we talk about Ivan Drago, and simply put, we are talking about one of the most iconic villains of the 1980s. I have done a previous video of the top 10 best iconic movie villains, and you can check that video out, and I will leave a link within the description. Now, I'm pretty much sure going into Rocky 4, we all thought, how could they exactly top Clubber Lang himself, played by Mr. T, was a true physical beast. The then very much unknown Swedish actor Dolph Lundgren, bringing his full physical form, 6'5", and his boom, almost robotic voice. They clearly found an antagonist to clearly top what we saw from Rocky 3. And here, very much in terms of a concept, we are very much presented here with a human cyborg. We see those beginning scenes where we're testing the true punching power of Ivan Drago, punching the technological pads, and we see the power levels going up with each punch that he throws. And this was a great job at the movie early on to establish straight away how imposing and how powerful this opponent is. Now, we have that often debate when people complain about the established heroes within movies and cinema, and that the general perception is that now you have to deconstruct them to keep them fresh. And I never believe in that. I always believe that if you want to keep a long running hero fresh and keep the overall narrative interesting, then one of the best ways to do it is to create truly powerful villains and antagonists for the hero to take on. By creating a more powerful villain, you therefore create a more interesting story. Now, going into Rocky 4, we all assumed that Rocky was going to end up the victor, but despite that, you go into it thinking, how exactly would he beat this huge, hulking 6'5" Soviet fighter? And that's the key, and that's what makes the story so compelling throughout this movie. Now, of course, when talking about Rocky 4, we have to mention the incredible training montages, which really emphasise something about Rocky 4 that I don't think is given enough credit, and that's the editing. It really is a true masterclass, seeing all of the quick cut, slow motion shots, the angled shots, all of the choreography, all of a great fusion together on such an expertise level. They really want to make you go to the gym and start training and working out. How many of us grew up watching Rocky 4, trying to mimic all of the techniques and exercises that Rocky performs on the speedballs, the dragonfly sit-ups, chopping the trees, the upside down sit-ups, all of the intense running and punches? There was a real concept to the training montages, as we see the raw training of Rocky, training outdoors with the outside elements. We see those multiple scenes of him carrying huge wooden logs, chopping them down, chopping down the trees, running amidst all of the deep snow. And we really contrast that with the more cybernetics, high-tech exercise technology training of Ivan Drago on the treadmills, doing the bench presses, all of the punch and abdominal simulators. So there's a real skill and precision in these montage and sequences, and it really shouldn't be underestimated. The sheer euphoric and adrenaline rush that these montages generate is really something that we've seen throughout the entire franchise, and I think Rocky 4 is the peak in its overall visualization of an athlete and performance. And of course, when we go back to the montages, they really are elevated by the movie's soundtrack. And when we look at the soundtrack overall in terms of Rocky 4, we really are looking at one of the greatest movie soundtracks of all time. Along with Vince Dakota's musical score, the soundtrack again is very much transcendent and really connects to you much more on an emotional level. We look at the songs overall, and of course the movie opens with the iconic Eye of the Tiger by Survivor from Rocky 3. We go to the ultra catchy and infectious Living in America by James Brown. This is from Apollo's ring entrance. The incredible and simply undeniable No Easy Way Out by Robert Tepper, as we see Rocky driving through reflecting on Apollo's loss, and we see the various flashbacks from the previous 3 entries. We have Burning Heart by Survivor, played midway through the film as Rocky arrives in Russia for his training. We have what I feel is a very underrated song, and that is the first training montage song, where we see the first bits of training from Rocky, and I love all the visual tones and the audio tones that we have. This is much more of a, I would say, mellow to begin with track, and then it really builds up to a euphoric climax. And of course we have the incredible Hearts on Fire by John Cafferty, perhaps the greatest of all of songs within this soundtrack. You simply can't deny it. It's such a infectious and undeniable song, perhaps the most motivational song I've ever heard. It really builds on that crescendo moment when Rocky reaches the top of the mountain shouting Drago. It really doesn't get any more iconic and transcendent than this. I simply defy anybody not to be at the very least stirred or stimulated when watching these overall sequences. And also we have the Vince DiCola track War, a truly epic song, and this is very much used for the iconic fight between Rocky and Drago. And when we come to it overall, the final encounter between Rocky and Drago still ranks today as one of the greatest cinematic fights of all time. It's firstly set up by the ominous Drago ring entrance at the beginning. We have that epic announcement. It looks like he's got a whole country in his corner. We see all of the smoke emanating from his entrance as he enters the ring, and all the Russian crowd are cheering him on. We have that suspenseful music, and we have those slow motion close-ups between Rocky and Drago as he's walking towards him. Fantastic, just a great way to set up a battle. And they continue this of course when we get the Russian national anthem, and once again we have that real sense of epic scope and anticipation. And when we look to the fight itself, it's such an intense, stylized, high-octane comic strip choreography sequence, so full of spectacle and drama and action. It's every bit as watchable now as what it was back then when I watched it for the first time. Now yes, you're going to get the naysayers who will comment about the supposed lack of realism, the fact that Rocky gets knocked down multiple times, and in a realistic fight the fight would have been stopped after the first round also. Well, that's the point of Rocky 4. It's not meant to be realism, it's much more of an exaggerated hyper-realism. This is very much of a fantasy, really presenting two gladiators in a ring almost, and that's the whole purpose of Rocky 4 and also the previous film, I would say as well. So when you are really pushing for realism, I don't think you are really understanding the concept of the whole film itself. Now after the shorter fight climax of Rocky 3, they really went for a far more epic climatic battle this time, and it truly is incredible, again pulling on your heartstrings and emotions and excitement as you see the two boxers go toe to toe. It doesn't matter who's taller than one another. These again presenting that image of two superior athletes at the peak of their game, and it truly is a thrill to watch. And the fact is, if Rocky 4 was to indeed to paint a far more realistic recreation of what boxing actually is, it wouldn't be that exciting overall. Now in terms of the franchise, we can always debate as which is the best fight, whether it is Rocky's fight with Drago or Rocky's rematch with Apollo in Rocky 2. I'm very much torn in many ways. I suppose there's much more pace and energy in terms of the fight in Rocky 4, but I think Rocky 2 was even more atmospheric in terms of the overall sound and the tension and the suspense. So make of it what you will, but both of them are truly outstanding fights, and particularly in Rocky 4, his fight against Drago again is one of the best cinematic fights of all time. So when we look at the overall impact of Rocky 4 in terms of its release, on a near 30 million budget, it managed to gross over 300 million worldwide. It became the third highest grossing movie of 1985, behind both Back to the Future and Rambo First Blood Part 2. And along with Rambo First Blood Part 2, Sylvester Stallone was really at his career peak commercially. Both of the huge box office successes of both Rambo and Rocky really established him at this point as the biggest movie star in the world in the 1980s, having two true cinematic contemporary icons at their prime in top of the industry. Now Rocky 4 was also the high engrossing film of the entire franchise, including the Creed films, without having to adjust for inflation, and still for me it still remains an iconic and integral movie. It truly is an inspirational and aspirational movie. Really before the Marvel movies, we look at the likes of Rocky 4 and the likes of Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jean-Claude Van Damme. These were our superheroes. These were the characters that we very much wanted to be when we watched them on film. We didn't care about diversity or representation. We just wanted to watch these cinematic heroes and icons on screen, and we very much wanted to emulate them, even if it was more of a fantasy wish fulfillment. That didn't matter. The likes of Rocky 4 really captured the imagination of a whole generation of viewers, and I think it's sad to say that we don't get movies or icons like Rocky 4 in movies today, outside of the superhero genre. Now as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we will indeed be getting a director's cut of the movie. It's rumoured to be about 30 to 40 minutes longer than the original version, which runs at around 90 minutes. Now I've made a previous video of this outlining my key concerns, as that whilst Yes, you could improve on Rocky IV, the original version, by perhaps having more scenes of Apollo, the fallout from his funeral, and giving Adrian more scenes as well. And certainly looking at the behind the scenes, it seems like Sylvester Stallone is going to add these elements, but my key concern is that he will take away all of the iconic montages and the soundtrack as well to try and make it contemporary, and that's really what will take away so much and special about Rocky IV, because it's the montages, the soundtrack, and that real sense of drama and spectacle and action. Watching a truly aspirational cinematic character in Rocky at the true peak of his performance, the overall arcs and evolutions of these iconic characters that we've grown to love so much since the beginning of the franchise, all of these things are what make Rocky IV a truly special and iconic movie, very much classic of the 1980s. And that's why I think in many ways it's perfect as it is and doesn't really require director's cut. An iconic classic, very much integral for me growing up in the 80s and a whole generation of viewers growing up in the 80s. So those are my overall thoughts and feelings and reflections of Rocky IV. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you were like me growing up in the 80s, I'm pretty much sure you identified very much with Rocky IV. How do you feel about the movie overall? Are you the same as me, or do you feel the other entries within the franchise are indeed superior to Rocky IV? Do you think it's the best or the weakest of the franchise? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And of course, when we get the director's cut, I will provide a review of that as well. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.